Welcome back to Channel Water. Today we're going to talk about God. I get a lot of questions about what my understanding of God is, or if I believe in God. And like all the other videos here, this is more of the introduction to the subject. We'll touch a few different aspects of the understanding of God and the relationship between God, water, consciousness. And of course, there'll be other videos that will go more in depth about it. I usually stay away from definitions that means different things to different people, because it's really hard to talk about God when we don't even have a discussion prior to that of what do you think God is, what do I think God is, what the other person understands it to be, and then after we establish that, talking about it. There's so many different concepts and ideas to what God is, and from the different religions or just different understandings and different approaches to the subject. Some might be more scientific, and for them, God is the old man in the sky, and that doesn't make sense. For somebody else, it might be all of nature, and for another person, it might be some entity that might be some alien life form. So when we speak about God, we can't just jump in and speak about it without knowing what the other person perceives it to be and why. The one thing I do like is the fact that we only have one word for God, which in a way reflects something that might get us closer to the truth about God. And it doesn't matter what you think it is, at the end, it has only one word. So it might be that when you put everything that people think about God all together, that is probably the closest thing to what it really is. Especially the way that I see it, doesn't matter what the thing is. For me, the concept of God is, the other word that I can think of is one. So whatever it is a one thing. One substance or one way of being. It's oneness. It's something that is itself and only itself and nothing else. So I like the idea that we have one word to describe it, because however you look at it, it's going to end up being something of oneness. I personally like to use the word consciousness, because consciousness is something that is both the ocean of consciousness, which is the bigger body that you might think of as the bigger body of God itself, and then the fractals that we are from that ocean of consciousness. And each one of us, for that reason, is conscious. So it's something that I have, it's something that I feel and know, my own experience of being conscious, and it's something that I can project forward and to the bigger picture of what consciousness is. So if you take any of my videos and you replace the word consciousness with God, it will be the same. That's basically, you can look at it from that lens, if that's what you choose, and that's how we want to call it. But I just don't want to push people away if they have their own concept of what God is, and then I talk about it here. It wouldn't make sense, or it would just ruin the experience for them, because they are a conscious being, and for them they can understand that experience of consciousness, when it's a much harder thing to understand the concept of God. So for me, God is consciousness, our spirit, soul, life force, all of nature altogether, everything we know and don't know combined. It's basically the biggest thing you can imagine and more, or the thing that you cannot imagine, because that is part of our limitation. We cannot understand fully that concept from the point of view of a human being. And some characters that we know or give God is that it's everywhere and in everything, that it's somewhat invisible, that it's a creative force, an architect, the creator, something that is the closest thing to infinity and singularity that we know. It's beyond mortality, it's beyond our experience. And that's where I started seeing some parallels between all of those attributes and water, as water has all those things too: being invisible, being in all living being, being the architect of nature, and being a singular entity that is infinite. Because water has no age, we don't know where it comes from, and water is the farthest thing we know from the material world. So it's not to say that water is God, it's more to say that through water, that life force operates in this world. So we can see water as being the glove on the hands of consciousness, God, life within nature. That's where the movement is. That's where the architecture begins. That's what all living beings have. Anything that's animated, alive, has feelings, emotions, creativity, are usually vessels of water. So if God was a substance, let's say, in this material world, it will be something that is one, something that is basically a continuum. Continuum is something that cannot be broken down further to anything else. It doesn't have a spectrum. It is the thing itself, beginning to end and always, and never changes. And water is the one thing in this universe that has the potential to be a real continuum. So if you research that concept and that idea, you will discover a lot of things about what does it mean to be one, to be something that cannot be anything else ever. And in many both philosophical discussions and religious concepts, that's how we see God, or even consciousness itself. We see it as oneness, and from there on it can build, make, develop into other things. But when you strip everything else down and take everything else away, it goes back to that one, that oneness, that singular entity that is, in this case, let's say water. In the physical world, that's our 0 point. And in the more, I guess, abstract form, that would be God, something that is even further and away from us, that we cannot perceive, touch, or know other than our own personal experience of being conscious. A lot of the issues we have with the subject comes from our limitation, being in this human body, being designed for specific purposes, and being the fractal that we are, the small vehicle compared to the bigger, larger consciousness. So we see life from our point of view, and we see ourselves as the center of life, and that is for a purpose, and I have a whole video just about that, the purpose of human beings. But that purpose and that design limits us in what we can see and perceive. Once we look at life from a different point of view, for example, water and nature, single cells, once we see life from that flow of life through matter, from understanding water as a symbol or a carrier of that entity, of that actions of God within this world, then we start seeing a different picture, and it becomes a bit more clear. Especially because we have so many experiences that we see as negative, and that makes us feel like maybe there is no God, maybe there is no goodness in the world, why certain things happen. And that doesn't work with the concept of an entity that is all-powerful and can do everything. But there is a certain pattern that we can see, and some people call it evolution, and they want to see it as a random occurrence in nature. But actually what it is, and that's how I call it, is evolution of creation. So we can see that there's a creative force in nature, and it is constantly building and making, and constantly getting better, and towards a certain goal. And in a way, that goal is gaining independence for water, for our spirit, within space, within this universe. And we can see that there are rules and laws of nature and limitations, building blocks. We can see that within this material world, which is just one layer of life itself, there's certain order and certain way that things happen. And that is by design, and that is part of the character attributes of this layer of life. Because there's other layers that are far more abstract, free form, but they are not as tangible and physical. So in this world, there are certain rules, there are certain ways that things happen, and within that we see an evolution of creation, architecture, and movement towards a certain goal. And within this layer of life, when we are here in this form as human beings, we are very limited in seeing the bigger picture. We are away from the bigger body that is all-knowing. That's why we feel that it's for us to maybe discover or understand things which are actually known. The reality is that there's no unknowns. Everything is known. We just work on need-to-know basis within nature. And just like the horse has blinds on his eyes so he can do a certain function, same for us. We have certain blind spots in order for us to be able to do a function and not get completely overwhelmed and distracted by all the different layers of life. Because there's so many other things that are happening right now around you that if you could see them, you would not be able to do your simple task of the everyday life. But our being and purpose is within God and not outside of it. We're not separate, where God, the bigger body of consciousness, is somewhere else and we're here. Or we have a purpose to find it. We are in it. We are doing the work within that equation, within that bigger body. There's no separation. And we're just on one side of that same coin. We're on a specific layer where we can't see all of the rest. But part of our function and being is to eventually achieve that connection back and achieve that full connection and knowledge. It was just within a different layer of life within this material world, as we're basically transferring knowledge, transferring and rebuilding a certain architecture within this universe. So we come from singularity, we fractal ourselves into these bodies, and then go back to a singularity where we can have that again, just with different materialistic characters and different, it's really a different architecture. That's all it is. We can see that a lot of our experience and feelings come from that fragmentation, from being away from the singularity and from feeling that we're kind of like pieces of magnets that are trying to get back together. So we have this draw both to each other and to finding back that meaning and that connection. And even in water, you see that when drops of water are near each other and they slowly pool and then merge. So we have so much of that feeling. And really that is part of our purpose and goal. And we see it as we create our social networks and we create different connections that are beyond our physical body. Let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between God and man. So we can describe it as the relationship between an ocean and a drop of water. The ocean is one body of water on this planet, which includes the atmosphere and everything that's moving through it. And then we are just a drop of water out of that big body of water. And we can see that that's our relationship when it comes to scale and understanding how grand is the bigger body of consciousness and that thing that we describe as God. What's really unique about consciousness is that it can fractal down. A fractal means that a smaller piece out of the bigger piece is basically independent of the scale. So the smaller piece is equal to the big piece, meaning that a drop of water in a fly or a dog or a person, it doesn't matter the size. The intelligence, the consciousness, the conscious being is there. It's not less. The only difference is the vehicle that it's in, that it's operating, and the ability of it. So it doesn't matter if you take one drop of water, one glass, a pool, an ocean. So you can think about a whale compared to a small fish. The difference is not big when it comes to behavior, understanding the consciousness that that being carries. So consciousness, God in that way, is a fractal. It can fractal down and operate in any scale. So you are a smaller version of the bigger thing. And that's really important when we start to try to understand what the bigger thing is, because the only way we can do that is from ourselves. When we look at our own experience and our own behavior and the things that we're born with, that we didn't even design. This is just what we are. So I made a little list of things that are God compared to man, just so we get the feeling of what the relationship is. So God is fully connected to everything, while man is isolated in this body. And we feel that isolation, we feel that loneliness, and really seeking connection all the time. God is all-knowing, while we are very limited in our point of view. And nature works in need-to-know basis, so also each person knows something so different from the next. And a good example is how we have different occupations. And we really break down knowledge into segments, and there's so many different kinds of occupations and things we do and things we know, and then we share it with each other. When on the other side, on God, everything is known at once all the time. God has a universal view, the bigger picture, understanding of much larger scale of life, while we are very much earthbound, and that's our point of view. And from here, we try to expand that view out to space, to the stars. We're constantly expanding, but we are very local in the amount that we can view and receive as far as data and our senses. God is love, while we experience also fear, stress, anxiety. We have a lot of other feelings and even hate. So that's something that's very unique for our being and our experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it comes from an evil place. It's more a type of functionality to create certain motivation and to get us to do our work, which doesn't have to be, and we talk about it a lot here in the channel, of how we can transfer motivation out of fear to motivation out of knowledge and love. God is infinite, it's timeless, it doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end, while we are mortal. In this human body, and just our human body, has a beginning and an end, a very clear duration of existence, while our soul, which is part of God, doesn't. God is reality and the most real thing that there is, while we live in a world of illusions. There's so many layers and so many illusions that construct our social structures and our understanding of life and our behavior. But as you know, when you strip all that down, you get to the real essence, and it actually has nothing to do with the human story. God is homeless. It's basically the entity that is before any concept of home or a place. There is no place. And we are the opposite in the sense that we created homes. We created even the concept of an address. And that was a very specific invention. When we created an address, streets to cities, our goal and definition was so we have a home in this universe. It was from the understanding that we are homeless to create that attachment to a place and the concept of a home. And that might reflect also about God and his basically lack of place or home. God is in no space, and I have a whole video about that. What is no space? What exists outside of time and space when we are in space? Our entire being is determined by the physical reality we're in, the fact that we are in a place, whether it's a planet, a house, a country, it's always about a place. And even in our body, the spirit is within a place, and that place is you. Your name is a place for the spirit. So as you can see, there's a lot of difference between that entity that we call God and our experience within this world. But at the same time, there are other aspects that are very similar, and specifically in our behavior, our creative side, from art to architecture, from entertainment to play, our feelings and emotions, and our motivation, our movement forward, constantly building, making things better. So I used to say we are the hands of the ocean. So as the ocean is building itself a home in the universe, because the ocean is homeless and in a way almost helpless. Any day it can evaporate or freeze forever. So the ocean is building itself architecture through plants, animal, people, and through us, one drop at a time, building itself a home in the universe, as we will expand out of this star and gain independence in space. So we are the hands of the ocean, building and making, and in that way, we are the hands of God. So we are continuing that work, and we are constantly trying to fulfill that purpose, where we're almost transferring the ocean one drop at a time to a new home, or into a home, basically. And we can say that God operates in the material world through water. So water is the glove on the hands of consciousness. We are those hands, and that life force is operating through that. So maybe that's why water is so magical, because it's that membrane, it's that moment where that abstract being is coming through and touching this material world. Because we know there are other layers, and that portal, that place, almost like a mirror between the two, is water. Because we can see in stories of creation how first water is separated between ocean and sky, creating atmosphere, between ocean and land, and creating that difference and having the land as material to build. Then life starts in the water, always. Life leaves the ocean coming up to land. Then we have plants, animal, people. So the entire story is always water-centric. It's always happening through the water. And even one of the first sentences, which is my favorite, is basically God, flying over the water. And it says over the faces of the water. And I think both for men and maybe in the bigger scale too, that spark of self-consciousness, that self-awareness happens when you see your reflection in the water. So maybe in the bigger scale that happened, seeing his own reflection on the water, and definitely for men, when you understand and see your reflection in the water, meaning you understand what water is, and you understand that it's your reflection, then you really become aware of yourself, of the bigger picture, of the water in you, and that cycle of water through nature. For that reason, I always say, in water man saw his reflection for the first time, both physically but also spiritually. Let's say that we're floating out in space and we're looking at the entire universe. If I had to choose one thing, one element to represent consciousness, God, life force, it is obvious that there's only one thing that can actually represent and symbolize that, and that would be water. It is the only active, creative, building, flowing, making in the whole universe. Fire is something that destroys what water builds. All the other table of elements are passive elements, building blocks. And water is the only one that actually uses all of them to create and destroy. But that is the only logical conclusion, is seeing that connection between the two. Water is the space for electricity, and we see it both from lightnings in the atmosphere to our own bodies, and to us as water in the invention of electricity, the use of it. Water is the place where all feelings and emotions are. Plants, animal, people, all have feelings, emotions. And there is no life without water, but I also say there's no water without life in it. When I was thinking about this subject, I was trying to also project up and see how we can understand the bigger body of consciousness, God, through our own being. And finding maybe beauty in that too, in how maybe God itself also has a playful side, like we, has joy, playing games, creating things out of just like artists. You know, we are so obsessed with making and creating and being original, especially our concepts of homes and understanding it. I was trying to think, like, we create, for example, games. And games were something that suddenly really made me realize something much bigger. So within games, we create a universe. We basically create a place where the game happens. We create rules, certain like laws of nature, right? There's rules and you can't break them and you have to obey to the rules of the game. Then you put players in the game, which is us. We both create the game, but we also play in it. And then it has a beginning and an end. So when I realized that, suddenly I realized how that's what this material world is. It's basically a creation of a place. In that place there's rules, there's laws of nature. Then there's actors, avatars within the game. And they are made out of the same entity that made the game. And that all fits together so perfectly in a way. And especially when you try to think, why is the world not perfect? Why things happen this way or that way? How come if God is almighty, it's not always perfect, always the best it could be, no suffering, no anything that is remotely negative or evil as we call it. And the idea of a game and the comparison to it was the best way for me to explain that. It's a choice of what this reality is. It was made with a place, it has its own rules, the materials we work with, the building blocks we have, the limitations of nature, like all of those things are constant. And then we operating within that. We are avatars of something else that is timeless. We have a beginning and an end, but the game can be played over and over and over again. Through that game, we achieve something, right? Even our own games, whether it's sports and different things, they achieve a much larger purpose. It gives entertainment, it gives employment, we build and create so much around it, from buildings to broadcasting to medical inventions. Like, the game is a way to move life forward and enjoy it too at the same time. And then you can see that there's different type of players in games. Some people enjoy the game no matter what, and some people focus so much on winning or not losing, cheating. Like, there's so many different ways of being within a game, and it's really the choice of the player in the game of whether they're going to enjoy it or not, and what's more important to them in that journey. So it's possible that God himself is creating life, this universe, and the play in it out of a personal search for meaning and purpose within no space. Because, like we said, that entity being what it is, it basically subscribes that it is in no time, no space, no place. It's basically the absolute nothing that can be anything. So it's nothing that has the potential to be every and anything. So then what do? You do exactly that. And creating that space to be all that and experience all that, right? Through mortality, you can experience so much more because there's so much more at stake and there's so much more meaning. And for that reason, it's so important that we find experiences and find ourselves within this game to a place where you can feel, enjoy, and really be able to do the work we do through motivation and joy, and really just having a good game in a way, not falling into the stress and anxiety of the fact that this game ends at some point. So in today's video, I just wanted to start touching on those elements of understanding what God could be. That when we talk about consciousness and the bigger body of consciousness, that is somewhere how I see it. If God exists, that's what it is. It's this ocean of consciousness that is coming into life and gives meaning to life. And for me personally, there is value in having that in my life, in seeing a bigger picture, seeing a purpose, connection, no separation. I don't see any advantage to saying that there is no bigger picture, there is no bigger body, there is no meaning, everything is random. There's absolutely no benefit to that. In no way it improves anyone's life to think that it's meaningless and random. So I think it's better to say that we don't know than to say that we know that there isn't something bigger. I don't even want to say that there isn't a God, but just even the concept of there is something bigger or not. One thing that's obvious to me is that we did not create human beings. We did not create ourselves. Nature is highly sophisticated, full of order, intelligence, consciousness. It is definitely not a random occurrence. So when I connect those two together, I feel that, to me personally, there's definitely what you call a God. There's definitely a bigger body of consciousness that I belong to. There's definitely meaning and purpose. And one thing that I always say is, I know that your God loves me. So it doesn't matter what you think God is, what religion you are. For me, if you claim that that is a God, one thing for sure, for it to be a God, it has to be full of love for everyone. So I think it's important for us to bridge between all the different concepts and understanding of what God is and to know that if your God promotes you to separate or hate anyone else, it is not a God. So that's the one thing I do know, and that's the one thing I always push for. We are part of one big body, and that body is a body of love. So when you walk away from it, that's when you start walking away from that love and from that connection. So this is one of a few videos on the topic. So please, if you have any questions or comments, write them down so I can incorporate them into the next videos. And thank you very much for watching today. We'll see you soon.